Mom and my sister live with us too. If you don't like it, sleep in the yard.
With a nasty grin, Joe seemed to say that was impossible. For Joe, I was just a convenient wife, and it was normal for him to throw such demeaning words at me. But I can't take it anymore. Then I'll start sleeping outside from today. No objections to whatever happens. In my words, Joe snorted through his nose. However, the next morning, seeing the yard, Joe became half crazed and regretted his words. My name is Michelle Brown, a 42-year-old freelance illustrator. At this age, I've built a career and make a decent living working from home. I lived in the city with my husband Joe. We didn't have children and enjoyed living just the two of us. I actually wanted kids, but Joe hated children and insisted he didn't want to have any. However, Joe's mother, Sarah, did not try to understand our situation.
A wife who doesn't have children is useless. In the old days, you would have been divorced without complaint.
Every time I went to his parents' house, Sarah would say such things with a sneering smile. Joe's sister, Susan, was also unpleasant like her mother.
Being a freelance illustrator is just an extension of child's play, isn't it? Getting paid for doodling, that must be nice. But you don't really make much, just leeching off my brother. After all, you're just a high school grad. A college grad, am quite different.
Susan would say this without knowing how much I actually earned. For reference, I earn about the same as Joe, who works full time. During busy periods, I earn more than him. Susan looked down on me, a high school grad, and took pride in her college education, even though she herself was currently unemployed. According to her, she could become a full-time employee anytime if she really tried. But she's already 35, and it's high time she got serious. The only decent one was Joe's father, Ron, who would immediately defend me when the two started their snide remarks.
Michelle is a precious daughter from another family. It's disrespectful to say such things to someone who married into our family.
When Ron spoke up, the two would be quiet for a while. But they didn't like that Ron took my side and would secretly harass me later. It was a vicious cycle, but I felt saved by Ron's presence. The one good thing was that Joe's parents' house was far enough that we didn't meet often. Normally, I'd brush off their comments as they weren't harmful. One day, while I was working as usual, "Wait, you're saying Dad passed away?" Joe called me suddenly during work to deliver this shocking news. Apparently, he had been suffering from an illness we knew nothing about. With the funeral preparations and everything else, I had no time to mourn as we were kept so busy. I couldn't return home for a while because Sarah and Susan left all the troublesome matters to me. When a person dies, I didn't realize how much paperwork and arrangements were involved. I was exhausted in just a few days. Somehow, after seeing Ron off safely and returning home, I thought I could finally settle down and mourn.
There are only Mom and Susan left in that house. I'm worried about the two of them, so we're moving back to my hometown.
What? You can't just spring that on me. What about my job? Then Joe, puffing up his chest as if he had accomplished something great, dropped the bombshell.
Don't worry, a classmate of mine runs a company back home and he's agreed to hire me. Everything's already arranged. You work from home, so it shouldn't matter where we live. There's no problem, so just relax.
Joe had made all these plans behind my back. After that, Joe ignored my reluctance and continued with the moving preparations. Reluctantly, I also started preparing for the move. Joe initially insisted on living with his mother, but I firmly refused to stay if that was the case. Ultimately, we rented an apartment a little away from his mother's house and started a new life there. However, after moving, Sarah and Susan would come to our house when they had no business, just to interfere with my work. Neither of them worked, so they seemed to have too much free time on their hands. I hinted several times that it was inconvenient for them to come so often, but my hints were too subtle to be noticed. Almost every day, the two of them would come over and do as they pleased. The stress was not just that. When the neighbors saw me, they would whisper to each other.
People from the city stand out, don't they?
Michelle, you do stick out. You really should try to fit in a bit more.
When I discussed this with Joe, Susan, and Sarah, who happened to overhear, made these snide remarks. Do I really stick out? Between the stress from Sarah and Susan alone, it felt like no one was on my side. I sighed deeply, regretting moving to this rural area. That day, Susan and Sarah came to our apartment for no reason.
There are no snacks in this house. You're not very thoughtful, are you? We are guests, after all. It's normal to have something prepared.
Sarah rummaged through the cabinets, constantly complaining. How could anyone deal with such selfish guests? I sighed to myself. Susan, sitting in a slouching position, then said to me,
Hey, Michelle, give me some money.
What?
I'm going to Florida for a trip. I'm going to a theme park with a friend who lives there. So I'm saying you should give me the travel money.
I was flabbergasted by Susan's shameless request for money and couldn't help but retort. Maybe it's about time you got a serious job and earned your own money. Then you'd have more to spend freely. My words made Susan very upset. She stood up roughly from her chair, slamming the table and shouting at me.
You're lecturing me? A high school grad like you has no right to lecture a college grad like me. Know your place.
Hearing this, Sarah let out an exaggerated sigh.
That's right, Susan is correct. Acting all high and mighty for Adele. After all, the money you're withholding was earned by our son, not you. It's audacious of you to talk like that with money that isn't even yours.
Sarah stood there, proud as if she'd said something profound. Apparently, they knew nothing. Joe had recently switched jobs to a company run by a classmate in his hometown, earning less than before. Thus, the pocket money Susan was demanding would come out of my wallet. But even if I explained this, they would never believe me. I'm sorry, but I'm busy right now. Could you please leave? After much grumbling, I finally managed to send them on their way. As they left with heavy footsteps, I sighed deeply, and then the neighbor from the next apartment appeared with an annoyed look.
Could you keep it down a bit? It's pretty loud.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Despite not being noisy myself, I ended up disturbing the neighbor because of those two. I had been living quietly to avoid causing any trouble. I sighed deeply once again. A few hours later, I reported the day's events to Joe when he returned home.
Being in an apartment, neighbor issues are bound to arise.
No, that's not the point. I was about to suggest that he talk to them, but Joe cut me off with a big smile, saying something outrageous.
I've been thinking this place is too cramped. You think so too, right?
Oh, well,
That's why I went ahead and bought a house with a yard.
Joe casually dropped this bombshell as if he was just saying he picked up some dessert on his way home from work. So unexpected was this that I couldn't grasp what he meant for a moment. A house? Wait, what do you mean?
It was a second-hand place, sold cheap. I managed to buy it with my savings.
Then I spent a long time telling Joe that normally he should have consulted me before making such a big purchase. But it seemed to have no effect on him. He was elated about owning our own home and brushed off my lectures. I was at my wit's end with frustration. But there's no use crying over spilt milk. And as Joe said, this apartment did feel cramped. So living in a house might be all right after all. I convinced myself. A few days later, we moved from the apartment to the house we had bought. However, we were greeted by Sarah and Susan, who were also there working. "What's going on?" I asked Joe with a trembling voice, and he responded nonchalantly.
Oh, I didn't tell you. They're living here too. The old house was getting too run down, so we're demolishing it and just selling the land. The construction contracts are all set, and the land sale is underway.
"Wait, why didn't you tell me?" Feeling dizzy from the reality in front of me, Joe casually started to explain.
Well, then let me tell you now. Mom and your sister are moving in too. If you don't like it, sleep in the yard.
Joe said this with a smug grin, as if it was something I could never agree to. At that moment, something inside me snapped. "Fine, I'll start sleeping outside from today. And don't complain about who I sleep with."
Why would I complain? Do whatever you want.
Watching our argument, Sarah and Susan gleefully chimed in.
Great, now we'll have the house all to ourselves. It'll be nice to have more space.
Why don't you just go back to your parents' house?
Ignoring their mocking laughter, I carried my belongings to the yard. Then, to prepare for sleeping outdoors, I called a certain person. The next day, I slept well. I stretched out mightily in the yard of the house Joe had bought. It felt like I had slept well for the first time in a while. After I moved my belongings outside, Joe spitefully closed all the house curtains. So he didn't seem to know I was out in the yard. But he couldn't keep the curtains closed forever. At dawn, Joe opened the house curtains. Seeing me in the yard, he was shocked.
What is that?
"Well, you said I could sleep with anyone I wanted, right?" Joe pointed shakily at the figure next to me and yelled.
Even so, who brings such a big dog into our yard?
My big dog, referred to as such, wagged its tail vigorously in response. This dog, a Rottweiler, is kept at my parents' home. Rottweilers are considered a giant breed. And that night, I had set up a giant tent in the yard and spent the night with my dog. After that, I called my mother. I explained the situation to her and borrowed the tent and my dog from my parents' house to spend the night here. I could have just borrowed the tent, but with the spacious yard, it was a perfect opportunity for my large dog to have a great time. My dog loves being outdoors, so as I expected, it was in a great mood all of yesterday. I too had a fun night and was in a good mood from the morning. However, Joe was pale and clearly not in a good mood.
That's your parents' dog, right? Take it back to their house now.
Yes, Joe has a big fear of large dogs. He included bringing the dog as a retort to Joe. He had been chased by a large dog when he was young, and ever since then, just seeing one scares him. This had even caused an issue when my parents had to take the dog away when we went to greet them. But that's another story. Hearing Joe shout, Sarah and Susan came to the yard rubbing their sleepy eyes.
What's all the noise about, Joe? So early in the morning.
Why is there a dog in our house?
They both cried out in pathetic voices. They too disliked dogs, and they had made faces when I mentioned my parents had a large dog. The sudden appearance of the dog seemed to throw them into complete disarray. Joe was nearly hysterical, demanding that we leave the house.
What are you thinking? This is why people with only a high school diploma are the worst. Unbelievable.
I never thought you'd be such a crazy wife. Who does this kind of thing?
You're right. What are you thinking? Have you gone mad?
While I remained silent, the three of them continued to berate me. It's so noisy this morning, don't you think? I asked while petting my dog, who wagged its tail vigorously. Despite his size, my dog is gentle and very intelligent, but he doesn't tolerate anyone threatening his family.
Can't you hear us telling you to get out?
Joe snapped, and the dog growled by my side. At his growl, Joe let out a pitiful scream, and noises came from the large tent where I had been staying.
It's lively this morning.
Dad, good morning.
Uh,
The person who emerged from the tent was my father. Joe, who had not expected my father to be there, cried out in shock.
Hey, Joe. Good morning.
My dad greeted him with a smile, while Joe stood there with his mouth agape.
I'm hungry.
Bro, you ate a lot yesterday, said the next person who came out of the tent, my brother. My brother, who is married and usually lives elsewhere, had come after hearing my story.
So, since we're all here, let's have a family camping in the yard. If they try anything, we'll be here to keep you safe.
That's why we decided to have a family camp.
Good morning. I hear my daughter has been quite the helper.
The last to come out was my mother. She smiled a refreshing morning smile, but her eyes weren't laughing. When I told her the situation yesterday, she was the angriest. While she doesn't show her emotions as loudly as Joe and his family do, my mother harbors a quiet anger. Her look towards the in-laws was icy cold.
Phil, Mill, and Bill too. It's been a while.
Joe's previous bravado had vanished. He twitched the corners of his mouth, attempting a smile. Joe can be bold towards me, but he's not so tough with my father and brother. The reason is that both men are physically imposing, and Joe is intimidated by them. My father is a muscular former military man who still exercises daily. Last year, he placed in a triathlon, confident in his physical abilities. And my brother is an active duty police officer, usually keeping our town safe. Heavily influenced by our father, he also spends any spare time he has working out. His wife and daughter are sometimes exasperated by how much he trains, but to me, he's a reliable brother. The family dog, who goes on runs with my father and brother, is also impressively muscular. Since he's been keeping up with their intense exercise regimen since he was a puppy, it's a natural result.
Well, while there's a lot I'd like to say, first, thank you for lending us your yard. We had a wonderful time together as a family.
My mother bowed politely, and the Mill somewhat automatically bowed back. Despite being surrounded by muscular men, the highest rank in our family hierarchy is my mother. The dog is most attached to her, recognizing her as the pack leader. Even now, he sat obediently by her side. Both my brother and father always say, no matter how much they work out, they can't beat mom. My mother may not be physically strong, but she knows how to assert her strength when it counts. Back when I was in elementary school and being bullied by a classmate, my mom immediately confronted the teacher and dragged the bully's parents to school.
No need for pleasantries. What reason did you have for treating my daughter this way? Let's hear it. Don't hold back.
Mom kept smiling throughout, but her presence was so commanding that eventually both the child and their parents started crying. At that moment, I vowed never to anger my mother. If I had consulted my family earlier, my parents and brother would have surely supported me. But I didn't want to worry them. I wanted everyone to believe I was happily married. So, even when I was harassed by Mill and Susan, and when Joe decided to move us without consulting me, I kept silent. Yesterday, when I called my mother, she was angry, but also deeply concerned on the other end of the line.
You've always been patient, but I can't bear the thought of you suffering because of it. After all, you are my precious daughter.
I am a grown adult, no longer a child needing my mother's protection. But hearing her words, I almost cried and deeply regretted not confiding in her sooner. And now my mother faced my in-laws with the same smile she had when confronting the bully's parents back then. The only other times my mother and the in-laws had interacted were during the initial meeting and at the wedding. They hadn't seen much of her since then, and probably never thought she could be so formidable.
I overheard how you've been mocking my daughter from inside this tent, calling her a lowly high school grad, saying she's out of her mind. Now, why exactly did you utter such vile words to my daughter? I'd like to hear it.
Her tone was polite, but carried an overwhelming sense of authority that didn't allow for any rebuttal. Her eyes weren't smiling at all, and each time she spoke, it felt like the temperature in the room dropped. Glancing at my father and brother, I noticed that despite not being the one scolded, they looked quite pale. Even the dog seemed intimidated, occasionally looking at my mother and shrinking back. The in-laws facing my mother's wrath were all visibly pale.
No, it's not like that, Linda. Michelle and I just had a little argument.
Oh, just a little argument, you say?
Joe scrambled for an excuse, but my mother's cold voice and expression only made him paler. Then Joe turned his frustration towards me.
That's low of you, bringing your family into this.
But I wasn't fazed by his attack. Well, you're with your family too, aren't you? It's hardly unfair. I quickly retorted, leaving Joe at a loss for words. He seems desperate to out-argue me, but Joe is clearly at a disadvantage. After a moment of thought, his face suddenly brightened. His face lit up as if he had just thought of a great idea. Then he confidently declared,
Fine, I want a divorce. You can't just do whatever you want in my house.
It sounded like he thought he had won. Could that really be his trump card? Thinking that mentioning divorce would shock me into apologizing. At this point, I felt nothing about being divorced from Joe. My love for him had been gone for a long time. I opened my mouth slowly, ready to drop a bombshell. I'm fine with a divorce, but you'll be paying for the affair and damages.
What?
You thought I hadn't noticed? In a small town like this, cheating with someone from your workplace was bound to come out. Yes, Joe was having an affair with a woman in her 30s at the company run by his classmate. And since she's also married, it would be a big scandal if exposed. I had been suspicious because he had been coming home late, and when I found a woman's handkerchief and a hotel receipt in his pocket, I was sure of the affair. There's no detective agency in such a small town, so I did some digging myself and found ample evidence of his infidelity. The evidence was so blatant, I wondered if he even intended to hide it. With this evidence, a lawyer can surely secure a good settlement.
Then let me introduce you to a lawyer I know.
Really? That would help a lot, Dad. Joe, not realizing his affair had been discovered, turned pale as paper. Yet, he still didn't give up and retorted with a trembling voice.
It's your fault. You're always busy with work and never pay attention to me.
To this, my brother immediately responded.
My wife works full-time too, but that doesn't justify having an affair. That's a pretty self-serving reason.
My brother looked at Joe with disdain. Being a married man himself, he couldn't understand Joe's reasoning at all, and his face showed it.
You're right. Basically, you're so unreliable that our daughter has had to work desperately. If you were a dependable husband, none of this would have happened.
My father also backed me up and attacked Joe. Faced with such valid arguments from both, Joe could only mutter and mumble in response. That's when Joe's mother and Susan tried to defend him.
It's definitely your daughter who is at fault. We're going to hire a lawyer and demand compensation too.
That's right. And even though she's working so hard, her job isn't that significant anyway.
My mother immediately countered their words.
Feel free to hire a lawyer, but the idea that someone who cheated could demand compensation is absurd. I feel sorry for any lawyer who takes on such a case. Do you not understand common sense?
With my mother's sharp words, Joe's mother involuntarily took a step back.
And Susan, are you unaware of how much my daughter earns? A simple search of her name shows she works with well-known companies. And you, speaking so arrogantly, yet you're unemployed at your age, mooching off your brother and his wife. Aren't you ashamed?
At my mother's words, Susan's face turned bright red.
How dare you say such horrible things to my family?
Joe looked at the two being defeated by my mother and glared at us with restrained anger. Although my mother was only speaking the truth, it seemed to irritate Joe. Facing such a Joe, I sighed deeply and spoke. Really, why did I ever marry someone like this? I'm appalled at my own lack of judgment.
What did you say?
Have you forgotten what you did to me? You have quite a convenient memory. And those two have been hurling terrible insults at me more than my family ever did. Calling me a lowly high school grad, a useless wife because I don't have children. Ever since we moved here, you've treated me like a convenient servant. Compared to that, my family seems quite reasonable, don't you think? I unleashed all the pent-up frustrations I had been holding back at the three of them. Until now, I had endured to avoid worrying my family. But there's no need to endure any longer. Let's get a divorce. I'm fed up with being exploited by you any longer.
Wait, Michelle. Let's calm down and talk this out.
There's no need to talk anymore. I want to cut ties with you as soon as possible. And no matter how much you talk, I will never forgive what you've done to me. You should prepare yourself for the consequences that are coming your way. My words were the final blow, and Joe collapsed right there. Joe's mother and Susan also dropped their shoulders, defeated. After that, we quickly prepared to leave and return to my parents' house. Well, I'll be going back to my parents' house now. I'll take care of the divorce and compensation claim later. I called out to Joe and the others, but they didn't respond. I sighed softly, packed my belongings and the tent into the car, and left my in-laws' house. Afterward, I successfully divorced Joe. Involving the lawyer my father recommended proved effective. My in-laws could be as tough as they wanted with me, but they were utterly weak against an authoritative third party. My demands for compensation were accepted just as I wished. However, Joe had just bought a house and had no savings. He tried to borrow money from a classmate who had employed him, but when the affair he had with a coworker came to light, his classmate was furious. For disrupting workplace discipline, both Joe and his affair partner were fired. Left with no choice, Joe borrowed money from the only consumer finance company that would lend to him to pay the compensation. But this finance company was quite predatory, and it seems he's struggling just to pay the interest. Joe's affair partner was also divorced by her husband, who then demanded alimony from Joe. With the double alimony payments, Joe ended up selling the house he had just bought to cover his debts. After selling the house, Joe, along with his mother and Susan, moved to a cheap, rundown apartment. Joe managed to find a part-time job, but he's been living a very pressured life. Susan finally decided to start working, but having no prior jobs experience, she couldn't even land a part-time job. His mother registered with a senior job placement service, but being in a rural area, There were hardly any jobs available, so ultimately, Joe was supporting all three of them. Living off his part time earnings was just enough for one person, let alone three, so their future looked bleak. During the days I went back and forth to move my things out of the in laws' house after starting the divorce proceedings, a neighbor suddenly spoke to me.
You're the new person who moved here recently, right? You're Brown from that house, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. The neighbor, looking concerned, said,
That family, the mother and daughter from that house, are quite notorious around here for being mean and acting superior. That's why we've all been worried about you. Hey, it's okay. If you ever want to talk, I'm here for you.
When I moved here, I thought the local people were keeping their distance because I was an outsider, but they were actually worried about me. Realizing this, I couldn't help but smile and relax. Thank you, I appreciate it. I told the neighbor I was getting divorced, and she looked genuinely relieved and said, That's good. I regretted moving to such a rural area and felt sorry about it. Silently apologizing in my heart, I took my belongings and left my in law's house. If it weren't for Joe and his family, this place could have been a nice place to live. I finished moving my belongings out of the in law's house and completed both the divorce proceedings and the alimony claims. Now, all that remains is to wait for the installment payments of the alimony to be deposited. But on the day of the last alimony payment, Joe sent me this message.
With this, I've paid off the alimony. This means my atonement is over, right? Let's start over.
I had left Joe's contact unblocked until the alimony payments were completed. Receiving such a creepy message, I deeply regretted not blocking him sooner. Start over with you? That's like some kind of punishment game. No amount of money would make me agree to that. Don't ever contact me again. If you try to reach out to me, I'll consult my lawyer. After sending that message, I immediately blocked Joe's contact. From that point on, Joe had no involvement in my life. After divorcing Joe, I returned to the city and began living a comfortable life. I treated the family who supported me to a nice spa vacation, generously using the alimony I received. The trip with my parents and my brother's family turned out to be a delightful time that will be remembered for a lifetime. Free from having to care for Joe and his family, I now have both time and emotional space. I could throw myself into work, but I don't need to work desperately anymore as I'm not financially troubled. With no need to support Joe's family, my finances are more comfortable. And after the failure of my marriage with Joe, I'm hoping to find a good relationship this time. Being single at my age isn't unusual in the city, and there are plenty of dating events for people in their 40s. It takes a bit of courage, but I'm planning to attend one soon. I'll never take myself for granted again. I'm the only one who can truly cherish myself, and I intend to live a joyful life from now on.